think that's great because it's not something we've quite talked about. It shows that we are. I think whenever we go say live, it's going to stop saying preparing. Hopefully. All right. It looks like we are live right now. Hey everybody! Thank you so much for being with us today. Now we are on Facebook Live. Well, you know that because you're on Facebook. But we just came from this riveting conversation at the New Church Hacks webinar on 16 action hacks to destroy, eradicate, attack racism. Our panelists got right into it. It was fantastic to just witness all the things that they had to say, all the wonderful tips and tricks that they have for us to really dive into being able to do this and do this with bravery. And so just to help you come into the room right now, as far as who's in the room, my name is Pastor Terrell. I am the leader of the conversation per se here that we're going to have today. I'm the minister of New Church Strategies for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, New Church Ministry. And I want to just take a moment to give all of us an opportunity to introduce yourself. Also, by the way, I identify as Black. So please tell us your race when you introduce yourself. Mark, why don't you help us out? And then we'll go to April, Yvonne, and then Nadine.
Hey, it's great being with you again. Mark Anderson. I'm the president and CEO of the National Benevolent Association, and I identify as white.
Likewise, it's great to continue this conversation with you all. I am Reverend April Johnson. I am Executive Director of Reconciliation Ministry for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and Minister of Reconciliation. And I identify as African American.
Hello there, this is Yvonne Gilmore. I am Associate Dean of Disciples Divinity House of the University of Chicago, and also privileged to serve as a core trainer of Reconciliation Ministries. I identify as African American. Great to be with you.
Hi, my name is Nadine Compton, and I am the creative writer and digital media specialist for Disciples Church Extension Fund, which includes New Church Ministry, and I identify as white and Asian.
All right, thank you all so much. We had a really good conversation. I just want to kind of start us off by giving any reflections about, like, we didn't get a chance to really respond to each other's hacks. So let's start. Nadine, you were in the room helping us out. You witnessed the whole thing. Maybe you can give us some of your responses about some of your favorite comments that came across the chat, or some of the things that the presenters had to say that really left an impact on you. And I just want to get that response from each of you. What were some of the most impactful things that were said today during our webinar?
I think what really stuck with me is when I said in the chat that I appreciated everybody using gender neutral terms instead of brother and sister saying sibling. And Yvonne made it a point to say that the use of brother and sister has historical precedence. That I think she mentioned, James Baldwin, feel free to correct me, that it was a leftover from slavery because you didn't know as a slave then, who was your family. And so this was a way to connect with your community and show relation. And so for me, that is something, and I'm Canadian, so that is something I'm unaware of. And so while we in the 21st century, might use gender neutral language, there is still a history of it, and it has different meaning for different people in different communities. So thank you, Yvonne, for lifting that up and educating me. Actually,
Yvonne, do you mind sharing more about that, or just even reiterating that what you said about that particularity?
Sure. So I was revisiting the Amen Corner, right? Is this poem by, not a poem, it's a play that James Baldwin wrote. He wrote lots of fiction, nonfiction essays, but also some theater. And so I was revisiting the play, the Amen Corner. And so he was talking about slavery and sort of the role of the Black church, right? And so he was lifting up the fact that the Black church, particularly as one of the only institutions that he would say that slaves were were able to actually have and lead, that it played a role in not reconciling people to slavery, but in helping them to, in his words, were to outwit it, I mean, I think we hopefully are doing more than just helping folks to outwit it, but in fact to dismantle. But was talking about the fact that often sort of in church even people might greet each other and say hello brother, hello sister, but that this history, right, comes from right, the fact that you were sold, right, folks had babies, you didn't have control over your family life or over your familial relationships, and so people began just to call each other, would say hello brother, hello sister, and part of that, right, was a way to try to claim, even without knowledge, right, of who your actual brothers and sisters were, but that because you could in fact be speaking to them, right, you didn't know because they may have been sold away, or even your husband or wife, or just family, period. And so it was a way to kind of signify that. And so I don't think, and I've tried to lift up, our conversation, that I think, for some folk, right, the sibling language works, and that for others, that they find it challenging, for different reasons. And so I think even just, right, being aware, right, of how we want to be identified, right, what is meaningful to us, what makes sense in terms of our social location, right, that it is significant. And so I appreciate, Nadine, I saw actually in the chat where you noted that you liked the language. And I think, and I can say, I think some congregations, right, have even learned to be aware, right, of their pronouns, right, aware of their language, aware of the ways that they identify people or speak about God. And I think that's a growing edge for all of us. But I would say in terms of thinking about liturgy, that in some ways is a growing edge for us. So.
While you're there, April, I'm sorry, Yvonne, why don't you tell us some of the more impactful moments from the webinar for you?
Wow. I think there were many. I'll say I was challenged by April inviting us to write a letter to our inner child. So that I think there probably are times where I'm always reflecting, and even as I raise my own girls who are 21 and 16, that I think a lot about the fact that right, that my childhood is different than theirs, and I at least think I'm pretty different than my own mom. But even in that, the thought, right, of being, right, ever cognizant of the way that the narratives, the patterns of relation, right, those modes of sort of seeing things affect me in terms of my childhood and relational and racial identity, that I really was challenged and encouraged, by April inviting us to write a letter to our inner child. Because I think too, the practice of letter writing, right, not only sort of entails reflection, but I think, it's sort of active and audacious in a way that is different than me just having a thought. But to like actually take the time to like sit down and like write something to myself, that takes the thought, right, to like this other place.
Yeah, that exercise would be super challenging for me right now. Like, I don't know if it'd be like saturated with encouragement and prophetic voice, or if it would just be like warning, like, hey, I'm gonna let you know there's gonna be a lot of this that you will encounter, and think like, what will that like? How many reams of paper do I get to to give to this poor child? And can I do a video instead of writing a letter? Is what I was thinking. But April, any reflections there, and then say some of the things that impacted you during the opportunity.
Right. I love it. I was inspired by that. There's a series on CBS this morning where it's called Note to Self. And the one that Representative John Lewis did brought me to tears. And it makes me think about because here's, John Lewis is still a senator, right? But he was like 17 when he started this work. And we're so concerned about protecting our children. As the children, our youth are telling us, we want to be involved in this movement right now. And as the church, the older adults are like, how can we prescribe that for you? And it's like, John Lewis didn't have anybody prescribing it for him. You know what I mean? So, but the story that he tells, and I also think, Terrell, the idea that it's maybe not a one-time event, that, you may get on your, on your phone or your computer and record at various times, you know, additions and corrections and addendums to your note to self. So, but it's active and it also helps you process. So that's the thing I like about it. It helps us to process, because the other piece is that doing anti-racism work is mental health work, because racism is a mental health crisis and we don't deal with that, you know, so you have to use all the tools and sometimes it's just the pen. Like using your voice sometimes might just be writing. So write a note to yourself. One of the things that stood out for me in the webinar today was the threads that all of us brought together. So a couple of things. The main one that came up for all of us was do your own work, do the work. And so often I have this expression I say to my inner circle when we're talking trash or whatever. I say, girl, I ain't telling you what I heard about, I'm telling you what I know about. But in this conversation, there's a marrying of what you know about and what you heard about, so that you have to do the work to know. So that when you're dealing with the emotions of the work, or what you think the work is like, or what I think it's like to be a white person with privilege, that's different than what I know about. So I have to marry those two. So doing the work was something that came out that was really profound and is open-ended, you know, so it was challenging. The other thread that I saw that was profound to me was the fact that we talked about accountability and never being alone. And some of that's personality driven, but the nature of racism, and I talked about Nadine racism in the United States, but really possibly, because I can't speak what I don't know, possibly in North America, because the timelines mirror each other. I have done that research, is that we tend to come at this work as a binary. We other a non-white, anything that that differentiates from whiteness, we other it, right? So then what we do is that in those other groups, we make them have those delineations. And so we create that. And so that sense of never being alone and accountability helps us to remember that we're not in this struggle or not even in this conversation by ourselves. But Yvonne reminded us that our tendency is to self-isolate. So I was again reminded of to be cautious of that.
Yeah, this notion of other comes alive for me very well in phrasings like you people, you know, or you or they. And I'm like, well, who are these they that we speak of? You know, and so during the webinar, I put myself on the spot to talk about microaggressions. And then it was like, I guess in the chat, people wanted to get examples. I should have told them, like, call me, email me, text me, whatever, because I got stories. Like, it'd be a whole nother hour's worth of webinars to really kind of talk about that. And I'm not sure I want to put myself through the trauma of unearthing some of those experiences. And all I gotta do is go to church again this Sunday, and it'll happen again and have a new story. You know, unfortunately, I've begun to expect it. You know, I'm like, okay, so what is it going to be today? And so I'll get to a church and I'll tell the pastor, I said, this is what my normal experience always is. And he or she will always say, that's not going to happen here. We're very anti-racist here, da, da, da. And then I'm so, I usually will be able to say by the end of my time with them what that experience was, and it enlightens them to even understand the work that is needing to be done within their own congregation. That idea that, you know, that's not who we are here, or that's not me, or I'm not racist, or you know, those type of things is, I think, a super deep struggle for some people. Like I've experienced this notion of reverse racism, where just even to call a person racist is an attack, you know. And so all of these things are very, very challenging to understand. But when we get, you know, later in this conversation, I do want to talk more about microaggression, because I believe there was some people present today who had even heard of that term for the first time, which probably was something we could have unpacked more. But Mark, please share with us some of your more impactful moments from the webinar today.
Yeah, thanks, Terrell. Let me pick up on that that last piece that kind of sparked a thought in my mind about the other, that I think for white people, we are able to other easier in that we talk about people of color, and the term is meant to be inclusive, but to also recognize that microaggressions, the discrimination, the prejudice hits people from various communities in different ways. And we've experienced that just here with this pandemic that we're living in, right? That Asian American are getting microaggression on a regular basis of that they're the cause of the COVID-19. Our Black siblings are the police brutality and are at higher risk, along with our brown brothers and sisters, at higher risk of contracting the virus. So it's trying to break this down that makes a more broader conversation, a deeper conversation. And again, even to claim that everyone who's African American, who's Black, experience the same thing. But I think for white people, it's easy for us to do the other, and we have to step back and figure out how to do that, right? So that we're doing this work together. To respond to kind of what was impactful, I think a couple things. Again, I'll piggyback on what April said and kind of the isolation of not to do this work alone. Any of you know me, I'm an extrovert, and so I have to have people around me. And so this is work that has to be done together, right? We can't do this on our own. So I really appreciate, Yvonne, you lifting that up of the isolation. And then also what I was hearing what I was seeing in the chat too, is people were talking about the church is the place for truth, right? And to be honest with you, the church isn't always the place for truth. And oftentimes it hasn't been. So I appreciate that as Christians, we really need to be about truth telling, and in church that, for heaven forbid, that's where we need to be doing it. And then one last piece to comment, April referenced a question that you raised, Terrell, at the end of the conversation, was about slavery and how is it still today? Is it still impactful? And to hear April's story about how a African American woman might respond to her child in a store. I think all too often you hear white people say, "I didn't create slavery; those are my ancestors. I didn't have anything to do with that." I think stories like that, of connecting back of what is going on today back to slavery, helps us educate and understand the privilege that we experience as white people.
Mark, yeah, I just wanted to add on to that and just say, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think with COVID-19 and the recent cases of police brutality, they've also exposed a myth in Canada that we have for ourselves, that we're a really nice country, we have a good looking head of state, la-di-da, but it's really exposed, like you said, not only microaggressions, but also outright violence that's been enacted upon Asian bodies, especially those who look or appear to be East Asian. I know, speaking from what I have, depending on where I am, I can pass as white, but my mother can't. She is brown, she's Filipina, and she's experienced, even before COVID, people question her place here because her English isn't that great. And I think, if you already are operating on a baseline like this, when you have a higher stress situation, it's just going to compound this distrust that white supremacy has bred in the population for Black and brown bodies. So the baseline racism that she's experienced is like this, and now it's just been amped up. But also that has to do with Black bodies as well, police brutality in Canada. And the unfortunate thing about Canada is that we have no national database that collects race-based violence. It's only if one of our national newspapers decides to do it, there is nothing that collects that information. So I can't even tell you what those numbers are. I had to go digging for it in preparation for this. So for us, a large part of our national conversation has to do with Indigenous peoples. So that would be First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So between 2007 and 2017, more than a third of the people shot to death by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Okay, those guys, they may look nice, but they're not nice guys. More than a third of people shot to death by the RCMP were Indigenous, but Indigenous people make up less than 5% of the population here in Canada. When it comes to Black people, I can only speak about Toronto, where I live, which is, it's a big city. Black people account for 37% of the victims, but they make up slightly more than 8% of the population. So there's a huge disparity there as well. So Canada, and I know there's Canadians on here, we're not off the hook, okay?
If you're joining us for this opportunity, we are having an after show conversation to help us understand more about race in an effort to be anti-racist and attack this notion of racism. You have Mark Anderson of MBA, the Dean of Disciples Church Extension Fund and New Church Ministry, April Johnson, who is the leader of Reconciliation Ministry for the Christian Church, and Yvonne Gilmore, who is also with Reconciliation Ministry and the Divinity House at the University of Chicago. And so we're talking about it. We just had this great webinar through New Church Hacks, where we dismantled some of those things that had 16 hacks that really kind of helped us understand this more. And we're here on Facebook now, being able to really kind of talk more about some of our experiences and things that we have had, our relationship to racism. And earlier during the episode, this notion of microaggressions came up. I shared some of the times that I have experienced microaggressions, not just through my entire life, but times that I experienced them, especially in the church. And I believe that it was the first time some people, because I think we take for granted, there's so many people, there are so many more people who have not done any type of anti-racism training, whether that be in corporate America, in their church, or what have you. They just haven't had to. And there are, single race communities where this notion of race is like, my cousin the other day just shared to me something that happened on her job, where there was a conversation on her job, and one of the young ladies who was white said, "I don't even understand the big deal. What are you guys so upset about?" And so, for her, she gets to live in this world where she doesn't understand what is the upset. And so she said, that's exactly the privilege that you have, that you don't really even get to have to deal with this to the point of upset. But one of the things I'll share was most impactful for me is the understanding in the sense that the question was brought up about the benefit. Why would white people want to dismantle racism, or a privilege or a benefit that they are that they're benefiting from? And out of that conversation, this notion of just like the human relationship and how our dependency on each other and the relationship that we have with each other as siblings and relationship with God and with creation causes us to all benefit when one of us are exhorted or improved upon, and then it destroys the entire system for any of us to be deprived or impoverished or any of these things. So it is the full benefit of the entire economy of Christ for all of us to really be very focused on anti-racism work and a lot of isms that are plaguing our nation. Nadine just kind of talked to us a moment about some of the differences between race as a construct in the United States versus Canada. And one of the things that we really didn't get a hard time getting into during the webinar was this idea of racism is not binary, in a sense that this is just a black-white issue. Nadine, can you maybe share some more about your experience being a mixed race person and some of those questions that maybe come up for you in that regard?
So my AC just kicked on, so just let me know if it's too loud.
Well, we want you to be cool.
So yeah, it does get hot in Canada. So I would say I'd have to return back to the microaggression conversation. Depending on the circles where I'm in, I get a lot of those comments that on the surface, seem so innocuous and innocent, but are really very sinister because they serve to other me and say, what are you doing here? Where are you from? And I've certainly done that myself when I was a new immigrant to Canada. Where are you really from? Because I come from a multiracial community in the Middle East, and that's a separate story. But for me, the microaggressions target to me as a person who's mixed with white and Asian, and that's very important, is tied together with the intersection of gender, because there is an idea of what Asian women do, how they speak, how they're supposed to behave. So oftentimes those, and I would say 100% of the time, those conversations have occurred when it's with me and a straight man, and they find out I'm Asian, and all of a sudden it's simmering right there under the surface. This kind of idea of who I am switches. And all of a sudden, I'm not white, I'm an Asian woman. And everything, doesn't matter who I am, where I am, what I do, it coalesces into this stereotype. I'm a person. When you're white, you get the benefit of being, you can be lazy, you can be smart, you can be slow, you can be fat, you can do anything under the sun. But when you're Asian, oh, no, you're like this. Oh, when you're Black, you have to fit this certain idea of who you are. You're not allowed to enjoy a full range of emotions. You're not allowed to be any profession under the sun. You're allowed to do whatever you want, but not by other people. Not by, when I say other people, I mean white people. And if they're the ones who are traditionally in power and in power of systems, then it changes, your an application for a job. If your name is hard to pronounce or looks like a new immigrant's name, like for instance, my mother, her name's Maria Lourdes. What does that sound like to a white person? Oh, well, maybe she doesn't know English that great. Maybe she shouldn't get this job. And it has a trickle down effect, and it seeps into every single aspect of your life. So it may on the surface sound like kind of a trite story, but I think if so many people share this, it's significant for a lot of the people that we interact with on a daily basis and around the world.
Wow. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say if I can jump in. Yeah, that I said it in the prior conversations, but just wanted to lift up, right, that microaggressions don't just relate to race, right, but to in contrast, and somebody helpfully put it in the chat, right, that there's macro sort of level in that. So these are smaller, subtle micro level, right, kinds of things. And I also relate it back to like passive aggressive behavior, right, that which are sometimes things that are less overt, less obvious. That sort of thing, and so people, there's microaggressions related to race. I identify with some of what Nadine was lifted up, and I forgot about it actually. But the people will say to me, "Your English, you speak so well. Your English is so good," and I just thank them and rejoice. And then I've let them know they think I'm Asian or they think I'm some other. That's what they'll tell me. They'll say, "You're Asian, right? Or you're Native American, right?" And I'll just say, "Well, I identify as African American," and I move on. But they're letting me know that they think that I'm not a native English speaker, and so therefore, congratulations that my English is is good. So I also wanted just to in addition to sort of highlighting the sort of meaning, right, of microaggression, but also wanted to lift up, and I wasn't thinking of this as a hack, but I think it actually sort of might be, right, that churches will say, right, that we're anti-racist, and we assert this, right, as a denomination. That I was thinking, we're calling that back when I was a new church pastor and started a church in Columbus, Ohio, and I had some folks who were GLBTQI call me and say, are we welcome at your church? And I said, of course you are. Absolutely, everybody's welcome. And they said, well, Pastor Gilmore, it doesn't say that on your website. And I said, well, it does. It says everybody's welcome. And they said, no, Pastor Gilmore. I don't feel safe if it doesn't say that. If it doesn't say, right, that GLBTQI are welcomed, affirmed, it doesn't say on the website, I don't feel welcome. That I'll say that I think that even churches, right, asserting and being committed to, you lifted up, Terrell, folks haven't had training, that sort of thing. But I think that the assertion to say we're anti-racist doesn't mean we're going to get everything right, as Mark lifted up, that like perfectionism, right? Anti-racism work is not, it's not perfectionism. Right, that to say we're not anti-racist doesn't mean we're going to get it all right. We may say things that are microaggressive, right? Our biases are going to assert themselves, right? But we can also, as a signal of our commitment, right, say, but we're striving to be anti-racist, meaning, right, we're actively committed to learning, practicing, embodying, right, a different ethic. So just, wanted to name that. I do think that's important, and I appreciate it that there are any number of disciples churches that have started kind of lifting that up and naming that, right, as a part in their identity statements to say that that's true.
So by saying so, are you saying that you encourage churches to explicitly say in their branding that we are anti-racist if they're predominantly white? Should they say Black people are welcome?
I'm not suggesting that. I mean, not singularly, right? Not singularly that, but I think to say, and even as we get away from the binary, right, of saying this isn't just a Black-white conversation, right? This does involve, right, all of our racial identities. That I think, asserting that you're anti-racist is asserting we're committed to learning and to practicing, right, how to be Christians, right, that dismantle racism.
And to piggyback on that question, Terrell, I think to claim, it'd be interesting on your key your sign outside, what's that terminology, or on your website, that you're an anti-racist organization, or what does it mean when we say all are welcome? To claim, for me to say anti-racism, that a church is anti-racist, means that they've checked all the box and say, okay, we can claim we're anti-racist, so we're going to put it out there. When really the message should be, we're working toward being anti-racist. So that I would assume, if, again, not being a person of color, if you're coming into the church with that information, I know then that I can ask you and say, what are you doing to be anti-racist? That anyone in that congregation is going to be able to tell me things that they're doing to engage in being anti-racist. I think that'd be an interesting thing for our congregations to lay claim to, right?
Yeah, I think sometimes they try to do this by saying that they are diverse. I remember visiting a congregation in Colorado. Before going there, I looked at the demographics for that city in preparation for my meeting and noticed that the percentage of Black people was less than 1%. It was some small percentage. I will admit that helped me shape the amount of time I wanted to spend there and feel safe there. But in getting there, I read the bulletin and I read how they boasted of being a diverse community. And I looked around for any diversity, racial, ethnic, and I didn't see it. So immediately afterwards, I asked the pastor, I said, well, this statement here that you are a diverse community, what does that, what do you mean when you say that? And surely enough, they meant ethnically or racially. And I said, well, this is not really written in the integrity of your identity because it's not true yet. So maybe you attain to be more diverse, but even with that, how do you plan to do that when there's no people around in this community that can actually feed into that or supply to that position of diversity? So I do understand what you're saying. It's like that goal, that focus is to be more anti-racist. April, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind. So I always use this language that we are while we're becoming. So we are pro-reconciling and anti-racist in our word, and we are becoming anti-racist and pro-reconciling in our deed. It means something different in every context. But I like what Mark was saying is that how do we cultivate the tools and the skills to continue in that process so that we are doing the work to model anti-racism or an anti-racist mission or identity, so that visitors like yourself will see it, and you're not looking at physical diversity as opposed, instead of you seeing psychological transformation around the identity of being anti-racist. A lot of institutions are trying to do this work, but think about how we talk about a conversation about race has resistance. Think about institutions that have been set up not to be inclusive, including the church, and how many practices go unexamined, and even in the examination of those processes, how long it takes to actually shift those processes, to actually change them, and the people who are tied to the way things always were, and assume that because they don't experience the lack of inclusion or even the numerical or physical presence of diversity, they don't have a sensitivity toward the fact that maybe the policies that we have are actually harmful, are actually limiting to people of color to be authentic. You asked us when we were preparing for this, I want you all to be your authentic self. And I remember that hit me so profoundly, because in this work, on many occasions, in this predominantly white institution and in my role, it is very, very difficult for me to trust this institution and the people who sit at the decision-making tables in this institution with my authentic self. They're hard enough on my passive-aggressive self trying to invite them into this conversation. And so, so that's the reality. But the fact that we have to unlearn the binary that racism has taught us. You're either in or out. And that, God has made us with all these different gifts, skills, talents, and passions that we bring to the ministry and mission of Jesus Christ. And that we have to make room for that by doing the work, by doing the critical self-examination of ourselves as individuals and ourselves as institutions. And that's hard work. That's examining stuff that, articles of incorporation. We did a task force years ago on racist language in our documents. And we found there's no racist language in there. We're not going to just call people names. We're just not going to write in our ordination procedures that if you don't have a college degree, you can still be ordained. Right? We're just not going to write that in. And we're going to put requirements in that people that may not fit those requirements tend to look like a certain way. So those types of things we have to do. That's critical self-examination that we have to do and get it down into our basic practice. Yeah. What does communion look like in an anti-racist congregation?
Communion within the disciples is often thought of the frequency of which we take up this Lord's Supper per se. And that's not really what it is as much as it is the access to the table, So this misnomer that we have to do communion every Sunday is a part of it, a potential part of it, but that access. And I remember my experience going to the founding place for the Christian church in Cane Ridge, Kentucky, I think it is. And when I went there, that church that was there, if you've never been, you should take a field trip to that location when the earth extinguishes and we can do field trips again. But it was a great experience, and it was a chilling experience because I remember going into this church, which was a log cabin, if you can imagine, of sorts, that was inside a building for its preservation purpose. And so when I went into it, we were able to, walk about the bottom, and then they were showing this balcony where the slaves were able to come to church with their master. But the passageway to get there was not a doorway or per se this staircase, but a ladder that people had to climb in order to get through this hole that was at the top of it to get into the balcony. So I remember climbing the ladder, going up there, getting in there and seeing what that was. And immediately I was like, no, I let me come down up out of here, because there's a freedom that's come from here. And I remember going to the pulpit and feeling like this is my authentic self. This is where God made me to be able to be as a leader, not having to climb this ladder. And that is the experience of this inequity, this privilege that happens there, where some get to walk in through the doorway. There are other of us who have to do the laborious work of climbing a ladder in order to have the same experience. And so these privileges and things like this blindness to these privileges is understandable to some degree. I understand how we can walk through life with these biases, but it is very, very, very harmful. And so I don't know, April, you opened this whole door of authenticity. Anyone else want to share just like some of the more authentic moments that they have had in their relationship with racism? I know we're on Facebook Live, and Facebook is the place where we be non-authentic or we get to filter our authenticity. But again, bring bravery into these conversations, please.
So I think that I've heard someone say this, that so racism is the evil that crouches at the door, right? And so it waits for the most unsuspecting person to come into the room. So it makes its way to a room, and many people are caught unaware because Mark was saying, we are taught, this is passive aggressive piece, we are taught to never talk about it. And because racism is so insidious in our history, right? It becomes the air that we breathe, so that we don't recognize it unless you are impacted by it. And because we don't talk about it and we don't really know our history, only know one perspective, because of that, we're either walking on eggshells when it comes up because we're not equipped to have the conversation, or we genuinely don't resonate with the experience of people that are impacted by it. We just genuinely don't do that. And it's so shocking, I believe, to the psyche of people who don't experience it on a regular basis, that there's this gap between trying to empathize and actually believing it. I think there's an expression going around now, people wearing t-shirts like, believe us. There's something that has to happen between between understanding that your lived experience is different, and intentionally, you've never been taught about this intentionally, so you don't have a frame of reference to talk about it or the tools, to the ways in which we then incorporate this into our practices as a church. And so we end up having this passive aggressive relationship with the topic of racism and the way it shows up in our church as an institution.
Yeah. And this is part of, as a white person, as white folks, we swim in white supremacy culture. So that's the culture that we all, unfortunately, are living in. And so to try and think what is racist or is not racist for white people, it is oftentimes difficult. And some of that is because of the white centering that our culture has done, and that we do as white people, is everything is centered around whiteness, right? And even Yvonne and Nadine, you were talking about language. The language is us white centering, is if you speak good English, meaning good white people English, then you're okay. But if your language is something else, it's not okay. And I think and so we, as white people, we are dependent on our siblings of color to call us out or to call us in. So, dear friend shared that, this was, whatever was happening was racist. And I'm like, no, I don't think so. Well, it really isn't my place to invalidate that person's experience of what that individual's experience as racist. So it was very beneficial for me to be called out, and we are dependent on one another to do that.
I wanted to piggyback on what you said, Mark, about the centering of whiteness, and also calling in people. And I think that's something that Asian Canadians, and I can't speak for Asian Americans, but I'll make that assumption that we struggle with, because a model minority myth was placed upon us when we immigrated here, when I say here, I mean North America, and that our proximity to whiteness is something that we have ingrained as something that is beneficial. Back home, a lot of it came out in ways of, Fair and Lovely, which is a skin whitening cream, because white is right. When I was born, and when many Filipino babies are born, the first question that is asked is, what is the skin color and how big is the nose? Because anything that mimics an indigenous way of looking or being means that it is barbaric, that it is not civilized. And I think that issue about civilization and what is civilized, what isn't too, is something that the church really struggles with as well, because we are complicit in colonization, especially with North America, and manifest destiny with the United States, and the erasure of indigenous communities and their land. And I think that also is something that brown people and Asians also have to, and immigrants really have to confront too, is that, okay, yes, we are victims of racism, but we can act that out upon other people as well. There's a lot of anti-Black racism in Asian communities. And we also, especially in Canada, we are still settling upon stolen land. So, and for a lot of churches here in Canada, we do a territorial acknowledgement. I would say not a lot, I would say some, where you acknowledge the indigenous holders of the land, but a lot of times it's just lip service, this lip service of reconciliation with indigenous peoples. And I think we also have to be more intentional about what we are actually doing beyond just saying that we are trying to reconcile. What are some more concrete ways? Like, have we talked to local indigenous leaders about what it means to be a guest on this land? Because that's what treaties mean, that you are a guest on their land. And I know that we don't have a lot of time, but that's just the tip of the iceberg there.
I just want to also name, as we're sort of speaking authentically, that I have experienced some things, but I also want to speak to, as I talk about combining challenge with hope in the kind of previous segment, that there's so much work to do, but also, right, that my energy, and part of why I can say, like, I'm going to resist isolation, is because I've gotten energy from this movement for homeless, right? I've gotten energy from the fact that I have mentors of every shade and people that love me and challenge me and tell me about myself, real positive, amazing things, if there are positive, amazing things to say about me. And of course, all of the things that I need to be humble about, right? And journey in, right? So I thank God, right? That, white, Black, Asian, Hispanic, every shade in between, and, across race and culture, right? That I could say that I really do, have mentors and people that love me, that going to camp, and I am not a camper, but going to camp, that I met people, and made friends and built relationships, and that even through trainings. I mean, where I'm tickled, I tell a story about encountering the police, and somebody says, Reverend Gilmore, police stop Asian people, and I'm like, I bet they do, but who are you talking about? And they're like, well, I thought you were Asian. So I was so surprised when you talked about the police stopping you and your kind of paralysis around that, right? But like, I'm grateful. May see you again, and we can keep talking about it, right? That like, I just want to name that I'm hopeful because of the relationships, and I'm hopeful because we have been doing these trainings, and I see these trainings changing, hiring practices, right? That for executive searches, we do trainings now to invite people to be aware of their biases. I see trainings changing, new churches and existing churches to begin to have a little better acumen, right? How they show hospitality, but also to take some risks, right? To just not assume that the only people that are going to come to your church are people who look like you, right? But to know that, like, no, like, God really blessed us also to be able to extend and welcome, folks from a variety of backgrounds. And we have resources, right, to in fact do this work. When I lifted up examples, during my talk, during the webinar, right, that I'm like, I want to name that in Illinois, Wisconsin, right, that they built the pool because they wanted different people to be able to swim together when that wasn't possible, right, in the wider culture. But that's a big deal. That is a big deal, right, for churches that have begin to create food sources, right? Because really related to access to nutritious food. That there are places, churches and Christ that have. So yeah, as we're being like, yeah, we're on the journey and doing some good work. Even as there's a whole lot, for us to continue.
Yeah, I do want to commend the work that is happening out of Reconciliation Ministry. That I will say, there's people in the chat on Facebook that are saying, this is their first encounter with this term of microaggression. And like I said earlier, there are institutions, people, communities that are not doing anti-racism training. So just even as we, close here within the next few minutes, I do want to understand a couple of things in our ending. How often should an organization go through anti-racism training? That's one. And then if you can help us understand this term, systemic racism. I think that there's a lot of people who had never even heard of that until recently as well. What does it mean for it to be systemically, for racism to be systemic? And is systemic racism at work in the church as an institution, as an organization? And I know I just asked 3 questions that could probably take us several hours. Right, exactly. So you got 2 minutes to answer all 3 of those questions. No, any one of you, please speak into those 3 topics, please.
So really quickly, I just want to say that anti-racism training should occur, from my perspective, annually. And it's because the conversation and is constantly evolving. We need to sharpen our knives, our tools, so that we can do the work. The conversation is part of the work. The training is meant to equip you. And very few, they might not do this anymore, but in the for-profit world, you have to sign a code of conduct after you do your human resources interview. And many of that, sometimes that includes diversity training. But we have an identity as an anti-racist church. And so that annually allows us to make sure that we have evidence that we are doing the work, not just doing the training, but every time you get together, it should compel you to some type of action. So that would be my answer to that question. I fundamentally believe, but I know that I'm in the promised land and I'm trying to get y'all out of Egypt, but it's my job to be in the promised land. And so in the promised land, annually, you should have it annually.
Do you want to go ahead and help us with a definition of systemic racism?
Yeah, so systemic racism, you will hear in our introductory trainings, you will hear that we don't talk about systems, as a matter of fact, that much. But systemic racism is distinguished from individual racism, where someone would say something, you say that's racist because it's harmful. But systems are the policies within the institution and the practices and the way in which the institution represents itself and the way it connects to the policies connect all the systems. So systemic racism shows up in the ways in which the criminal justice system has policies that impact oppressed communities differently than it does white communities, policies that benefit white communities and white dominant narrative. So that's the system. So education, criminal justice, even real estate, who can participate in federal housing. All of those are systems, and yet individual racism contributes to those systems, but systemic racism is the way in which we've all been conscripted into a narrative of whiteness as a dominant narrative for all of us. So that's systemic racism, and that's what first thing we try to help you debunk, is that we're not talking about racism on an individual level. A good example is the woman in Central Park they call Karen, Amy Cooper, is a racist, right? But Amy Cooper was counting on the system to do her bidding for her, so she could say, oh, just stay here till the cops come, right? Then I'm still good, knowing she had violated the big old sign and many signs that said, leash your dog, didn't apply to her. If she didn't want to be accountable to those signs to the Black man, she would just call the system, but her behavior was racist. But the consequences for the Black man in the system were much more dire than her individual act of racism, if that gives people a visual.
That's helpful. That's helpful. Mark, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up about the question about how frequent anti-racism training, and April was spot on. Reconciliation Ministry in partnership with Regions are doing some amazing work in that area. So yes, once a year, but I would call out to my white siblings, you have a lot more work to do than once a year training. And that there are many more trainings out there. There's stuff that you need to be doing, we need to be doing instead of waiting for that 1 year training. White folks, we got a heavy lift here. People of color have been doing this for a long time. And so we can't just wait to check off a box that we did some training.
Yvonne.
I was going to say, I think, they've already, and Mark just alluded to it in terms of training in regions around the church, right? That often clergy training is required for clergy. But I would say that it's also a really good idea, right, for churches and communities and different institutions to do it so that it helps them fine tune, their practices. It helps them become aware of their biases. It helps them become aware of ways. It isn't just to do it, right, to check off a box, right, but it's to equip you to better serve your community, to even see needs that you may not recognize are there, and to really affirm, right, our whole identity, right, as people of faith. As well. So I think it absolutely, right, it is in the church as we look at our own hiring practices, as we look at inequities in terms of funding and which ministries get funded and how, and who has what resources, as we look at, who gets to go to camp. There even are, in terms of looking at our relationship to Indigenous persons and our land and schools that we that were open, land that we took away, or even that there have been disciples' properties on former plantations, or that sort of thing. That looking at all of our history, I think there's lots of places for us to inspect and interrogate, and then to begin to figure out how do we reconsecrate and reclaim and bless and come out of that history right together in a more whole way.
Okay, as we close, I want to give each of you an opportunity to share a resource for our Facebook family that you think is has helped you in this fight or in this journey so well. And I'll end it, but whichever one of you are most prepared to go ahead and share a resource. And just to let you know, we will be posting this video as well as the webinar playback at newchurchhacks.com. So please look for that here soon. Who'd like to start, please?
I can go. I'm not muted. So I like books. I didn't realize how much I like books till I looked around my office here to see how many I had. So even though everybody's doing Kindle, I still have a lot of paper books. So I read Dr. King personally. His messages are so generous and confrontational at the same time. And so they give me courage. In this particular one, Strength to Love is one of my favorite collections of his sermons. And then one that I read a few years ago that is structuring my thoughts now is Jennifer Harvey, Dear White Christians, Those Who Still Long for Racial Reconciliation. And the reason why Jennifer Harvey's work, and she has one for how to raise white kids. But the reason why this particular Dear White Christians works for me, and it might not work for everyone else, is because I am challenged by this notion of reconciliation that we were ascribed to venture into in 1967 and 1968, when whiteness was so centered. And as we ask the question, what are we reconciling to? I'm wondering, and Jennifer challenges this as well, is the definition of reconciliation that we currently have relevant for the landscape we currently live in? So I recommend those 2 books, but it's a lot of them over here. Like, do your history, do your work. Read the Bible from the Margins, Miguel de la Torre. Shonda John, ladies and gentlemen, Room at the Table, History of Disciples. And Ibram Kendi, controversial for many anti-racists, How to Be an Anti-Racist. But his book on Stamp from the Beginning, amazing. History. Do your work. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Nadine, are you ready to share?
Yeah, sorry, I was just furiously typing it out so that I made sure I got it right. So mine are all, because I do my work on social media, they're on social media. So for Filipino Americans, Filipino Canadians, I suggest that you follow E.J. Ramos David, PhD, that's what he calls himself, at EJRDAVID on Twitter. He did some really good conversations on there because he is Filipino and he is married to an Athabascan. And so his children are also mixed race. Conversations about you're not half this and half the other, you're 100% one identity and 100% another, which has been a huge revelation for me and my own family. And then also to follow Rachel Elizabeth Cargill, that's what she calls herself, at rachel.cargill on Instagram. And also if you want to talk about controversy, follow Shishi Rose also on Instagram at shishi.rose. Open my eyes. She does not let anything slide about anti-Black racism. She goes deep. So if you want to really feel uncomfortable, follow her.
Great. Mark, please.
Yeah, thanks. The 2 books that kind of speak to me currently that I've recently read, Me and White Supremacy, Combat Racism, Change the World, and Become a Good Ancestor. Layla Saad is the author of that book. And then a book that I just started listening to. It's hard to get a hard copy of this book because it's going around so much that people have referenced, is My Grandmother's Hands. Resma Menachem. I'm butchering that. I just started listening to it, but it is about, in order to destroy white supremacy culture, it actually isn't in the mind or even in the heart. It's actually body work, and talks about the trauma that white bodies experience, that Black bodies experience, that blue bodies, and referencing to police, and how generation of trauma, and how that's been carried forward, and how we have to do this body work in order to get past this trauma and get on the other end of this white supremacy culture. So I've just, like I said, I just started the beginning of it, but it's a fascinating read. So I encourage folks to check that out.
All right, thank you. And then Yvonne.
I would recommend, I said it during the webinar, but would recommend Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil by Emily Towns. I recommend Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. And then I'm also going to lift up, I have the privilege of working as a project director of Constructive Theologies.org, but it's the Constructive Theologies Project. And these are disciples, leaders from academics, new church planters, chaplains, some congregational pastors, but who are writing and thinking about race and theology in our denomination. So early on, one of them says, we don't have a numbers problem, we have a theology issue, right? We need to get clear about our theology as disciples and how this relates to race. And we need to get better, right, at articulating it. So if you go to constructivetheologies.org, you'll see some of them are just narratives and experiences, kind of blog posts. Some of them are essays. We're about to, you'll see this soon in Disciples News Service. We're about to invite you to send us your sermons, your reflections, your own blog posts, and where we hope to have a greater catalog, right, of disciples' voices and resources. So even before it comes out on Disciples News Services, I'm announcing that, we're expanding that. So yeah, send us your resources and materials as well. Yeah, thank you so much, Terrell.
You're welcome. Hey, thank each and every one of you. I'll give you my resource real quick. It's not a book. It's not a blog, it's not a tweet, it is life. My experience with racism and expanding any internal biases that I may be challenged with has just been by being immersive. You know, I often, and of course this is because of the diversity that lies within the New Church movement, but I am often in environments, I go to churches where where it's not predominantly English spoken, and where I am with other races, and I'm having those experiences. Now, granted, I'm not white, so I have a different relationship with racism, but as far as color is concerned, and classes is concerned, and all these different isms and constructs are concerned, I intentionally immerse myself in environments that are not like me. I sit in that tension. I ask myself the right questions. I ask questions. I ask permission for moments of ignorance so that I can really get closer to the truths that may be present there. And I just live life in that immersion, and that teaches me some greater things that I can unearth about myself, because I'm really just trying to change myself. I know that there's a work to do greaterly, systemically, globally, all these different things, but I mean, at the end of the day, the well-doneness that may come from God just goes to how much I am able to do that work within myself. So I encourage you, pick up all these books, all these resources, go to the pages, go to the websites, but then when you finish doing all that absorption of learning and knowledge, go out and live life, experience the amazing beauty that God has put out there in this body. I mean, oh my God, everybody's so gorgeous. All these different skins. I'll say you cannot be color because you don't want to miss all this beautiful blackness that is before you. I mean, you cannot be colorblind because I don't want you to miss the beautiful blackness that stands before you. You know, don't diminish all the things that are happening. I often tell my wife, I've had someone come up to me, Microaggressions, would say, hey, I wish I could be black. I was like, why would you want to be black? You know, you're beautifully white. That's how God made you. Be beautifully who you are. And so throughout this journey, there are things that we must unearth that are not quite Christ-like, but ultimately we are all really working towards being our most God-like self, and to help be a part of this mission towards wholeness in this extremely fragmented world. The Christian Church Disciples of Christ is happy to continue to join in with each one of you, our siblings, towards that end. Thank you so much for this opportunity for us to interrogate your ear gates with some of our thoughts and some of our knowledge relating to this notion of attacking racism. Again, you will be able to capture this and other conversations that we have, other hacks, recordings that we have at newchurchhacks.com, and contribute to New Church Ministry at newchurchministry.org, or to NBA at nbacares.org, or to Reconciliation Ministries at disciples.org. And I'm sure they can visit the University of Chicago Divinity House at some construct of that. Just Google it. All right. We love you. We thank you. And we will see you again soon. Let me close out the live.